The first sign that something had gone wrong was not the missing horse but the sound of iron striking stone in the dark, quick and guilty, somewhere beyond the east pasture where nobody honest had business after midnight. Calla Rowan was already moving before the echo died. She came out of the bunkhouse in her father's old work shirt, caught the saddle with one hand, and swung onto her gray mare bareback, the night air cold enough to taste of tin. If you're listening from a porch, a kitchen, a truck cab, or some far country where the evening finds you with your hands still busy, say your place softly and ride a little while with her, because the road that opened under Calla that night began in the sort of darkness people remember for years. The mare, Junie, stretched under her like a thought she had already had. Calla did not waste breath calling for help. The help on Juniper Trace had gone home before sundown, and her father had been coughing half the evening in the room off the kitchen. She rode past the windmill shadow, through rabbit brush silvered by moonlight, and over the first rise where the east fence showed itself in pale, broken angles. Ahead of her, 3 saddle horses and a knot of half-broke mares were running blind toward the wash, their hooves drumming hardpan, their fear sour in the air. One small sorrel colt had fallen behind and was bawling in that thin, wild way young things do when they understand danger before they understand the world. Calla rose in the dark and let the loop fly. Rope hissed, settled over the lead mare's neck, and for 3 pounding seconds every animal in that tangle fought a different battle. Junie braced. Calla dropped her weight low, gave line instead of stealing it, then turned the mare just enough that the running knot began to bend with her. It was the oldest lesson she knew. You did not beat panic head-on if you wanted anything worth saving. You let it feel the truth of your hand and made it choose the safer ground. By the time the lead mare slid, snorting, into a half-circle, the colt had reached her flank and the rest followed from the blind obedience fear sometimes teaches. Only then did Calla see the gap in the fence. The top wire had been clipped clean, not snapped. The post nearest the gate leaned inward as if a shoulder had hit it on purpose. She dismounted, crouched, and rubbed the wire between thumb and forefinger. Fresh, bright. Somebody had done it after moonrise. Somebody who knew the pasture held young horses not yet wise enough to stop when they smelled open country. Somebody who also knew Juniper Trace could not afford to lose even one animal before the banknote came due. When she walked the Maras home at first light, Amos Rowan was on the back step with a blanket around his shoulders and a coffee cup growing cold between both hands. Age had taken some thickness from him in the last 2 winters, but it had not taken the level set of his eyes. He listened without interrupting while she told him about the clipped wire, then looked past her at the east pasture and breathed out through his nose. "Merrick's getting impatient," he said. "You say that like patience was ever his strongest gift. It was when patience bought him more than force." Calla took the cup from his hand and felt how cold it had gone. "You should have stayed in bed. And let you do all the worrying alone? I've still got my manners." She tried not to smile, but that was never easy around him, and he knew it. Amos had raised her with long silences, fair work, and the kind of affection that did not announce itself. He had never once asked her to be softer for the comfort of people who confused softness with goodness. But he also knew the town better than she did, or perhaps more sadly. Rillspur had a way of taking a woman who worked like a man, spoke plain, rode fast, and deciding that whatever could not be placed politely at a supper table must be called wild. She heard the whisper anyway. Too wild for pasture. Too wild for church. Too wild for any man who wanted peace in his own house. Calla tied the yearlings, lifted the feed order onto the counter, and made herself stand still while the clerk counted slow. Stillness cost her. Stillness always had. Across the room Merrick Shaw stood near the flour sacks in a coat too fine for honest weather, speaking low to Sheriff Penlow with one gloved hand resting on the silver head of his cane. Merrick was not an old man, which somehow made him worse. His smoothness still had ambition in it. He wore his beard trimmed close, his boots polished, and his courtesy like a card-sharp smile, displayed only so you would forget to watch his fingers. When he turned and saw her, the smile warmed by a degree that meant trouble. "Miss Rowan," he said, "I was hoping to save your father the ride. Is he strong enough for the meeting this afternoon? If the meeting concerns our land, he's strong enough. I'd hate for the strain to worsen his cough." And I'd hate to mistake concern for hunger, Mr. Shaw. A faint sound moved through the store. Merrick's eyes thinned, but his voice stayed gentle. The note is a business matter. Nothing more. Business doesn't usually cut fence wire after midnight. Sheriff Penlow shifted. Merrick adjusted one glove fingertip. That is an accusation. No, Calla said. That was an observation. If I make the accusation, you won't have to wonder. The store door opened before he could answer, and a stranger stepped in with a saddle over one shoulder and the road on him from hat brim to spur. He was tall in the loose, weathered way of a man who had lived more years outdoors than in rooms. His coat had been mended at the elbow with careful stitches. A pale scar ran from the edge of his jaw into the collar shadow at his throat. What Calla noticed first, though, was his left hand. 2 fingers bent a little wrong when he lowered the saddle. Not useless, just marked. He asked the clerk if Rillspur had use for a horseman who could mend tack, sit a night watch, and stay out of other men's ways. His voice was deep but unhurried, a man who wasted neither words nor breath. While the clerk answered, the stranger's gaze slid once to the burr of cut wire still caught in the hem of Calla's skirt. His eyes rested on it the way a farrier's thumb rests on a cracked hoof. Not curious, knowing. Amos came in a few minutes later, though Calla had begged him not to. He wore his dark coat and his good hat, which made his thin face look sterner than it was. He nodded to 3 men who owed him favors, none of whom could quite meet his eyes. By 2 o'clock they were all crowded into the back office above the mercantile where notes were called, extensions denied, and whole lives reduced to ink if you were unlucky enough to need mercy from men who preferred arithmetic to fairness. Merrick laid the paper flat. Amos owed on last year's feed and the replacement pump after the north well had run brackish. Drought had shaved the herd. Prices had fallen early. The terms were ugly because Merrick had written them ugly. What I offer, Merrick said, is a kindness. Sign the spring rights over to Shaw Grazing and remain in the house until your last day. Your daughter keeps her room, of course. Perhaps we even retain her as stable manager. She does have a talent with difficult stock. Calla stared at him. It took her a beat to understand that his version of generosity required her father to surrender the one strip of water that made Juniper Trace more than dust with fences around it. Amos's mouth hardened. Juniper Trace is not for sale. Everything is for sale, Merrick said. Timing only changes the price. It is not for sale. Merrick folded his hands. Then the note is due in 30 days. Amos had taken harder blows in his life. Calla knew that. He had buried a wife, outworked 3 bad seasons, and once set his own shoulder with a saddle strap when the nearest doctor was 30 miles off. But something in him went altered as he stood there listening to a younger man price the ground he had watered by hand. His knuckles whitened on the table edge. When he straightened, Calla saw the gray move into his face so fast it frightened her. Pa? He tried to answer. What came out was half a breath and her name. Then his knees gave. The room lurched into motion. Somebody shouted for water, as if water solved every kind of failing. Sheriff Penlow caught one arm too late. Calla was already down on the floor with Amos's head in her lap, feeling the terrible looseness of a man whose strength had always seemed too stubborn to leave him. His eyes found hers once. For an instant they were clear. Basalt markers, he whispered. Sweetgrass. Don't trade. The Basin. She bent close. What Basin? Pa, stay with me. But the clarity had gone. They carried him home in the freight wagon with the stranger driving and Calla in the back holding Amos upright every time the wheels dropped into a rut, though the doctor told her by lantern light what her hands already knew. The stroke had broken more than speech. Amos lingered through the dark, breathing rough, while coyotes called thin on the ridge and Calla sat beside the bed telling him small, practical things because big ones would have split her open. The coffee tin needed filling. Junie had thrown a shoe. Dinah Pike sent broth. The East Pasture Maras were back in their lot. She did not tell him she was afraid. She had never once handed him fear if she could help it. Near dawn, rain threatened and failed. Amos opened his eyes a final time, not quite to her, and the hand on the coverlet moved as if searching for reins. Calla laid her hand over his. He settled. A little after sunrise, With the windmill creaking and the first flies beginning their mean work at the screen, he was gone. By afternoon the house had acquired the strange politeness death forces on rooms. Cups stood where women had set them. Boots lined the porch in borrowed quiet. Dinah Pike moved through the kitchen with one red, watering eye and a habit of humming through closed lips when grief made silence too sharp. Sheriff Penlow came, hat in both hands, and left too fast. Merrick Shaw sent flowers so white they looked like surrender flags from another war. Calla took them to the chicken yard and fed them petal by petal to the hens. People stayed until dusk because that's what decent people do when a good man dies, and also because everybody wanted a look at the daughter who now stood alone between Juniper Trace and a man like Merrick Shaw. She thanked them, took the food, stacked the plates, and did not cry where they could see it. She cried only once that evening, and even then only because Amos's boot scraper still held the imprint of the mud from the last day he had been well enough to work. The stranger from the store fixed the back gate before leaving. He did it without asking, setting the new wire tight and true, then carrying the broken post to the woodpile as if no other use existed for his hands. When Calla stepped out to tell him supper was on the stove if he wanted it, he had already washed at the pump. Up close, the scar at his throat looked older than the one in his hand. "I appreciate the gate," she said. He tipped his head once. "Wasn't much. It was enough." He looked toward the east pasture, then back at the clipped wire she had hung on a nail by the tackroom door. That cut was made with shears, not fence pliers. Clean jaw, narrow bite. Ranch foreman I rode with in Wyoming used a pair just like it. "You ride with many men who opened other people's gates in the night?" Enough to know the difference between weather and malice. She should have asked his name sooner, but grief makes strangers of simple courtesies. "You got one?" "Hale Mercer. Calla Rowan." "I know." She almost bristled at that, then let it go. Everybody in Rillspur knew her or thought they did. Hale glanced toward the dark house and then down the slope where the pasture lay black and waiting. "If you need a hand till the burying is done," he said, "I can stay a few days. Wages later if later comes." Later. The word sat between them like a dare. Calla looked past him to the land her father had left her without meaning to. The west field needed cutting. The pump coughed. 30 days sat on the table in ink. Somewhere out there, under basalt markers and a dead man's half-spoken last instruction, lay a basin she had never heard of and a chance so small it barely deserved the name. The world she had woken in that morning had ended before noon. By dark she understood that every hour ahead would have to be taken, not awaited. "Stay," she said. Hale nodded as if she had told him nothing surprising. In the pasture, a horse struck a post once with the side of its hoof, sharp and restless, and the sound carried up through the dark like something refusing to yield. The burying took place 2 days later under a sky too clear for mercy. Amos Rowan went into the ground on the low rise above the cottonwoods, where he could see both the house and the east pasture if the dead kept any sort of watch. Men who had traded with him came in clean hats. Women who had leaned on his quiet fairness brought pies and small stories. Reverend Sloat said the usual things about labor, rest, and the Lord's own fields. Dinah Pike cried openly. Calla stood straight beside the grave in her black dress and boots, fingers wrapped hard around the brim of her hat, and listened to the dirt begin to fall. She did not notice Hale move until he was close enough that his shadow crossed hers. He stood a respectful distance back, hat off, eyes on the grave, looking not like hired help but like a man who understood that grief has its own weather and no use for chatter. When the crowd finally thinned and only Dinah remained to gather plates, Calla stayed by the fresh earth until the sun leaned west and the mound lost its raw color. Dinah came up behind her with a jar of water and the soft, practical wheeze that always lived in her chest. "Your pa once told Ezra that you came into the world squalling like a hawk and kicking like a mule," she said. "He sounded proud as a king." Calla swallowed. He should have gotten a quieter daughter. "Hush. Half this town mistakes noise for steadiness. They call a storm calm if it ruins folks politely." Calla almost smiled at that, but the smile faltered as Dinah pressed something into her palm. Amos's watch, the one he kept on a leather cord rather than a chain because chains broke and leather could be mended. "He had this beside the bed," Dinah said. Thought you ought to be the one carrying his time now. After Dinah left, Calla opened the watch. Inside the lid, scratched so fine she nearly missed it, were 3 words in her father's hand. Macaulay saddle lining. She stared at them until the sun shifted again. Amos had said Sweetgrass. Basalt markers. Now this. He had left her not comfort but instructions, which was perhaps the kindest thing a man like him knew how to do. That evening she went to the tack room while Hale was setting the broken stirrup on a mare's saddle and cut open the lining of the old Macaulay stock saddle. Her father had not ridden in 10 years. Dust fell first. Then a folded oilskin packet, flat as a prayer book and twice as precious. Inside lay a copy of a territorial survey, a hand-drawn map marked with basalt cairns, and a page torn from some older ledger with figures beside the words Sweetgrass Basin water allotment and shared drive easement, renewed by witness A. Rowan E. Crowell L. Pike. Calla read it 3 times before her breath changed. Hale did not step closer until she looked up. You found your basin. My father found it. He just neglected to tell me I owned part of it. Not neglected. Hale wiped a bit of oil from his thumb. Maybe he thought he'd have time. There it was again, petty as a creditor. She spread the map on the tack table. Sweetgrass Basin lay west of Juniper Trace beyond Knife Creek Notch, a pocket valley sheltered by basalt bluffs where an underground seep fed a stand of blue grama and late clover. It was farther than their cattle should travel in drought and trickier than any buyer would approve. But it existed. More than that, the old paper showed Juniper Trace had a lawful drive easement across a strip of land Merrick Shaw now claimed as his south pasture. If we get the herd there, she said slowly, they can water, graze 2 weeks, maybe 3. Long enough to put flesh back before the county sale. And long enough to keep Shaw's hands off them if he comes counting heads. She looked at him. You talk like you've spent time around men who count other people's cattle before they're dry from the brand. I have. Working for them? His face went still in a way that said more than denial would have. Once. Calla folded the paper. Grief had already stripped away her appetite for easy trust. Then you know why I don't offer it cheap. He met that without offense. I wouldn't respect you if you did. The easy path stood plain before her. Sign the spring over. Keep the house until winter. Let the town say what it had always said. That Amos Rowan's daughter rode hard and lost. The harder path required moving nearly every breathing animal Juniper Trace had through country most hands in Rillspur would refuse, on the strength of a dead survey and a map hidden inside a saddle lining. It required hiring a stranger whose past pointed toward the very man trying to swallow her land. It required believing that the wildness people mocked in her was not the flaw they named but the only thing equal to the hour. She went to the door and looked out toward the corrals where the young bay stallion Amos had bought last spring paced the fence in circles too tight for peace. Every man in town who had seen the horse had called him useless, mean-backed, ruined by blood and temper. Calla had never heard useless in the stallion's movement. She had only heard fear with nowhere decent to go. When she turned back, the choice was already made. We move at moonrise tomorrow, she said. All stock we can stand on 4 legs. We take the old drive through Knife Creek Notch, not the lower road. Shaw will expect the road. Hale nodded once. I'll need Dinah's wagon for water barrels. Ezra Pike for shoeing by dawn if he'll come. Tobin Greaves to run messages. And if Sheriff Penlow asks where we're headed, you tell him the truth slowly enough to waste his time. Hale's mouth bent at one corner. Yes, ma'am. She frowned. Don't yes ma'am me like I'm 80. Wouldn't dream of it. Word spread by breakfast, as bad news and bold plans always do. By noon 3 men had stopped by to tell Calla the basin was too far, the notch too narrow, the herd too thin, the season too dry, the old map too old, the hired hand too strange, and the whole idea too much like proof that she had finally lost the little sense God meant women to keep. 2 women came to say the same thing more kindly. Dinah Pike arrived with jars of rendered tallow, a biscuit sack, and Ezra behind her carrying shoes and nails. Unexpected loyalty has a way of entering a yard without announcing itself. At the pump, while Ezra worked Junie's front hoof, Mrs. Coyle from the post office passed in her buggy and called out, "You'd do better to let a sensible man take over, Calla." Calla stood, wiping sweat with the back of her wrist. "If you find one, Send him along. I'll put him to mucking stalls. Dinah snorted loud enough for the hens to scatter. Just before sundown, the bay stallion threw himself against the corral rails and split the skin over his chest. Calla vaulted the fence before Hale could stop her. The stallion rolled white-eyed, blood dark on bay hair. Snaking away from the rope, she tried to ease around his forequarters. She could calm him 9 days out of 10. But grief and haste had made her hands a shade too sharp that evening, and frightened things notice sharpness first. The stallion struck, not quite at her, enough to drive her backward into the post. Splintered wood raked her palm open. She swore low. Blood ran quick between her fingers. Hale was over the fence in 2 strides. Leave him. I've got him. You've got one good hand and a horse full of lightning. That should have angered her. Instead, she found herself breathing too hard to answer. The stallion shuddered, blew foam, and slammed again at the rail. Calla wrapped her cut hand in the edge of her skirt and tried to knot the cloth with her teeth. It slipped. Her fingers would not quite obey. Hale held out his right hand, patient as shade. Come here and let me try. No man in Rillspur had ever said those words to her without a grin underneath them. Come here and let me try usually meant let me prove you're too much, too loud, too difficult, too wrong. But there was no performance in Hale's face, no challenge, no pity. Only an offer. Calla crossed the small space before she could think better of it. He took her wrist gently, tied the cloth firm, and looked at the wound once before releasing her. Then he turned to the stallion. He did not dominate the animal. He lowered his eyes a fraction, shortened the rope without jerking it, and waited through the first violent minute like a man letting rain spend itself on his coat. When the stallion hit the rail again, Hale stepped with him rather than against him. Not surrender. Agreement. A way through. Gradually the horse's head dropped. The whites of his eyes went less bright. Folks call a river wild, Calla said before she meant to speak, when it won't run through the ditch they dug for it. Hale glanced at her over the stallion's neck. Then maybe the river's not the problem. It was the truest thing anybody had said to her in years, and it landed so quietly she almost missed the bruise it left. By full dark, Juniper Trace was ready. Then Sheriff Penlow rode in with 2 deputies and a paper nailed to a board. Merrick Shaw, invoking unpaid debt and concern for public safety, had petitioned to restrict all stock movement on the lower Rill Road pending seizure review. Penlow looked as if he wished to be anywhere else while he read it aloud. Calla waited until he finished. Good thing we're not taking the lower road. Penlow blinked. You can't mean to go through Knife Creek at night. I can mean a great many things. You'll lose animals. I'll lose everything if I stay. The sheriff glanced at Hale. And you're advising this? No, Hale said. She's already decided. Something like reluctant respect moved through Penlow's face and vanished. He nailed the order anyway, because men who serve better men learn early which courage their wages allow. When they were gone, the night settled in close and hot. Dust hung low over the yard. The cattle, sensing change, began their uneasy bawling. Calla mounted Junie, flexed her bandaged hand once, and looked at the people gathered in the lantern light. Dinah on the water wagon with her shawl pinned tight, Ezra mounted despite his stiff knee, Hale on a chestnut gelding with Amos's old rifle across his back more for wolves than men, young Tobin pale with importance atop a mule too patient to argue. At the gate, Calla turned in the saddle. Beyond the yard lamps the grave rise showed faint against the stars. Her father's house stood dark except for the kitchen window, where the lamp Dinah had forgotten burned steady. If the only road left to you was the one everyone else called foolish, if keeping your soul meant risking the very thing you loved, would you take it? Calla touched her heels to Junie and opened the gate. Knife Creek Notch was mean country even in daylight. At night it became a throat of black stone and echo, narrow enough in places that 2 loaded wagons could not have passed without one backing a quarter mile. The herd moved into it in waves of hide and breath, hooves striking sparks from buried rock. Dust climbed until it turned the lantern glow to old amber. Calla rode the left flank, using whistles and the pressure of her mare's shoulder more than rope, keeping the cows from crowding the wall where loose shale might start a slide. Ahead, Hale and Ezra managed the lead steers. Behind, Dinah sat rigid on the wagon bench, Hands closed around the break as if stubbornness alone could keep wood, water, and hope from tipping into the ravine. They had made 2 hard miles when Tobin's mule slipped at a bend and jammed the rear flank. A little panic ran through the cattle, a shiver of bodies turning wrong. Calla spun Junie downhill, shouting once, sharp. Hale's whistle answered from the front. For a heartbeat the herd held. Then a shot cracked from the rim above. Not aimed to kill. A scatter shot into stone, meant to spook. It worked. The cattle surged as one blind weight. Dinah screamed something lost under the roar. Junie lunged sideways to keep 3 heifers from climbing over one another. Calla saw the outline of riders on the rim, blacker than the sky, and knew Merrick had not trusted Law alone to do his work. "Hale!" she shouted. "Drive him forward!" Came back through dust and thunder. "Don't let him turn." A second shot shattered rock beside the wagon. Ezra's horse bucked. The rear wheel struck a buried boulder and slewed toward the ravine edge. Water sloshed. One cask broke loose. Calla could not be everywhere. That is the oldest cruelty of crisis. She chose the herd first because if the cattle turned in that notch they would kill themselves and half the people with them. She leaned low over Junie and drove into the surge, cutting across the leader's nose, forcing one big white-faced cow to bend. Then another. Her throat filled with dust. Something hot stung her cheek. Above, the riders moved like scraps of burnt paper along the rim. Then Hale was beside her, chestnut horse blowing hard, his hat gone. 3 men, he said. "One's Bristow from Shaw's South Camp. You know them?" He took too long to answer. "I know the kind." Thunder came closer. The canyon gave it back in pieces. Calla saw accusation in the pause before she heard it in her own voice. "How well did you ride with Merrick's men, Hale?" "Well enough to leave." That was not an answer, and the storm gave them no time to demand one. Lightning ripped the rim white. The lead steers bunched at a shelf no wider than a porch step, and for one ugly second Calla had Amos's old war bridle half in her hand, ready to force obedience the cruel way and save the herd by leaving something smaller but permanent torn behind. Then the bay stallion screamed against his rope, fear plain as a child calling in the dark, and she dropped the bridle back to the saddle. She put Junie shoulder to shoulder with the balking lead, sang one low barn lullaby her father had used on feverish foals, and waited until panic remembered it could breathe. 1 step, then 2, then the whole line bent and moved. Hale saw what she had refused to use. He said nothing. He only wheeled uphill when 3 riders broke for the Basin turn and drove after them through rain and shale. By the time the herd spilled into Sweetgrass, his hat was gone and blood darkened one sleeve, but the men on the rim had fallen back. What waited below might have broken weaker hearts anyhow. Merrick had already found the Basin. Fresh cross shaw posts cut it in half. The easy spring had been diverted, and the grazing lay trampled flat where his stock had stolen first use. For a breath Calla thought the land itself had turned against her. Then Junie lifted her head toward the bluff wall, and Calla saw a thread of wet moss climbing a seam of basalt no wider than her wrist. The water had not died. It had been hidden. They broke the false fence before dawn and climbed the bluff with crowbar, rope, and stubbornness. Hale anchored her with his good hand while she hammered at the seam until the shelf rang hollow and split. Cold water burst across her shirt front and into the trough below. The cattle smelled it before the people cheered. By sunrise Sweetgrass was breathing again. Only then did Calla notice how pale Hale had gone. She got him into the line shack, cleaned the furrow in his upper arm, and wrapped it tight while rain drummed the roof and Dinah muttered at the stove over coffee gone black from neglect. Outside, the herd drank with the desperate gratitude of creatures granted another day. Inside, silence made room for truths both of them had ridden too long to avoid. Hale told her about Ruth. The wife fever had taken while he was far from home earning money he had mistaken for love. Calla told him about Ben, the brother lost in spring water after following her where she had crossed safely first. The words were plain, almost workmanlike, and that made them hit harder. When she finished, Hale looked at her the way a man looks at country after finally admitting he has been lost in it. Some people carry pain so straight, he said, the world mistakes it for pride. If you've ever heard a truth arrive that quietly, You know why folks stay a little longer by a fire and why they keep company with stories that remember them. Calla sat with the words and did not run from them. When one of Shaw's riders limped in thirsty and empty-handed a little later, she could have kept his horse or turned him back dry. Instead, she let both man and animal drink and sent him away with a warning instead of a wound. Hale noticed that too, though he never praised it. What he did bring her, once the storm lifted, was a warped oilskin notebook. Inside were copied tallies from the years he had ridden under Merrick Shaw, missing weight, shifted brands, feed charges written twice, enough crooked arithmetic to prove Merrick's hunger had been wearing a gentleman's coat for a long time. Sheriff Penlow reached Sweetgrass by noon, saw the illegal fence with his own eyes, and told Calla the seizure hearing would be held before the whole town by late afternoon. So she came back not alone and not pleading, but at the head of a herd heavier than the one that had left, with Sweetgrass water still drying on the hides. Rillspur came out to watch. Merrick Shaw was waiting in front of the mercantile with his cane and his courtroom manners, prepared for a woman in debt, not for a woman carrying proof. The hearing moved to the church because no other room could hold that much curiosity or conscience at once. Merrick began with the note, the dates, the default, and the soft language of men who hope politeness will hide theft. Calla answered with the survey from Amos's saddle, the Sweetgrass easement, Hale's notebook, Ezra Pike's witness that cross-Shaw irons had been laid over cattle bought cheap from desperate owners, and Bristow's reluctant confession that Merrick had sent riders into Knife Creek to turn the Juniper herd back before dawn. Each truth alone was a stone. Together they built a wall. When Merrick finally lost patience, he called Hale a drifter and Calla a horsebreaker too wild to steward anything men valued. The room went still. Calla could have humiliated him then. She could have named every laugh she had swallowed in that town and made the whole church taste it back. Instead, she laid Amos's watch on the table and spoke as steadily as if she were calming a frightened colt. She said the land had never asked her to be smaller. The horses had never needed gentleness that lied. Her father had trusted her reading of drought, fear, and water, and the herd standing outside was answer enough to anyone still wondering whether Worth required permission. That was the moment the town changed. Not with applause, but with the colder, harder thing that matters more. People began revising what they believed in public. The county assessor suspended the seizure before sunset. Sweetgrass Basin remained under Juniper Trace's legal use. Merrick's books were ordered open for review. He left the church standing straight, but some men lose more from a room's silence than others lose from a shouted defeat, and by winter his power in Rillspur had thinned to money without trust. Juniper Trace did not become easy after that. It became possible. The basin watered through late drought. Calla and her neighbors rebuilt the catchment in stone and shared the drive rights fairly. Buyers started coming for her horses because they traveled calm and held weight. Hale stayed first for the fence, then for branding, then because leaving kept sounding less honest than staying. On the first cold morning of October, Calla found him in the east pasture teaching the bay stallion to yield by patience instead of pressure. And she understood at last that what the town had called wild in her had only ever been truth refusing the wrong hands. At dusk on the anniversary of Amos's death, she rode with Hale to the grave rise and left a clover sprig from Sweetgrass, a new horseshoe from the bay stallion, and the banknote marked settled in full. When they came back down to the house, the kitchen lamp was already lit. At the gate she stopped him with one hand on his wrist and asked him to stay, not for the season, not until the next storm passed, but plain and permanent. His answer was a quiet yes, the kind a person can build a roof under. On one long summer evening after haying was done and the Sweetgrass water ran low and silver through the new stone catchment, Hale came up from the lower field, set his shovel by the gate, and looked at Calla as if gratitude had finally found the shape of a home. A good horse doesn't bow to the hardest hand, he said, only to the one that never lied to it. Calla slipped her fingers through his, and the first star came up over the east fence while Junie and the bay stallion stood easy at the open gate below the kitchen lamp. If you want the next ride, wait until you hear what arrived in Rillspur one winter night inside a violin case full of letters and one name nobody had spoken in 20 years. Until then, rest warm.